want to talk about is baking bread, specifically why you would want to get into baking your own bread when what's available at the grocery store is so inexpensive. And then, if you are interested, 4 things that you really want to use if you want to get into bread baking. So, first, I'm going to discuss why anyone would want to bake their own bread. Because, like I said, a loaf of bread is about $2, maybe $2.50 at the grocery store, and it's really not very bad. So, the number one reason that people think they want to get into baking bread is to save money. And if you're buying sandwich bread, you're probably going to find that you're not really saving that much money. You are producing a loaf of bread for much less than $2.50, but since it's so inexpensive, you're really not saving that much money overall. Where you really start to save money is when you're baking French and Italian, more artisan style breads. And those are my favorite kind of breads to bake. They're very easy. They're the kind that are normally done freeform. So you're going to braid it or shape it into a round loaf and then either bake it in a Dutch oven like this or just freeform on a baking sheet. And those type of breads cost a lot at either bakeries or the grocery store. They're also the easiest to get right. So they're great for beginners and they are a great way to save money. The second reason, and my favorite reason for baking bread, is because it's fun. So when I first started bread baking, I was a stay-at-home mom. I had a toddler and I had a newborn. And I was home all day, sort of doing nothing but chasing up after them, cleaning up their messes. And I felt like at the end of the day, nothing had really been accomplished, even though I was so tired. And I got into bread baking and it really changed my life. And I know that sounds dramatic, but it gave me something fun that I enjoyed doing. At the end of every day, I had a beautiful product. I had something I could share with my friends, and I just loved to do it. I loved every single step of it. And that is probably the number one reason that people stick with bread baking, because they enjoy the process. It's a fun hobby. And speaking of hobbies, a lot of hobbies are very expensive. Sewing, even gardening can be expensive. They require a lot of startup costs, like a machine, and then they require a lot of supplies. Bread baking is not like that. There are some startup costs if you want to make the investment in some of the tools I'm going to talk about later. But if you don't want to, you can get started basically for free, just with flour, yeast, water, and salt. And you're going to have an actual usable product at the end of it. And it's really just one of the best hobbies, especially for stay-at-home moms, because you feel so productive. The third reason for baking bread is the improved taste and freshness of the product you're going to get. Home-baked bread is much better than store-bought, and I used to not really believe that until I've been baking my own for years and then had store-bought French bread, and it's terrible. It just does not taste the same as store-bought, unless, of course, you're going to a very expensive bakery and getting a specialty product. So just to recap, the top 3 reasons to bake your own bread are: number 1, it will save you money. Number 2, it is fun. And number 3, you will get a better product. So if I've intrigued you at all and you decided, okay, I do want to start baking bread, I just want to discuss very briefly 4 things that you will want to get. The very first thing is a recipe. So I do follow a lot of baking blogs, and there's this trend lately in the bread baking world to sort of say, oh, you don't need a recipe. You want to be baking by feel. You want to look for the texture of the dough. You want to add a little buckwheat, no, I think this is just terrible advice for a first timer, because it's too confusing. If you don't know what bread dough is supposed to look like, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Mixing a bunch of specialty flours is complicated, and white flour actually gives you the best tasting results. So you'll get there. If you start baking bread and you keep on working at it, you will eventually get to the point where you can bake by feel and add in a lot of specialty flours. But don't start there. Start with a recipe. And speaking of flour, you really want to get a high quality one. When you're baking bread, basically 90% of what you're eating, if not more, is just flour flavored with a little bit of salt, sugar, and then the yeast to help it rise. So the flour is very important. My favorite brand is King Arthur flour. I really like their bread flour. I use it for almost all of my breads. Bread flour, if your recipe calls for it, is super important. It's the only way to get that chewy crust. So it's really important if the recipe calls for bread flour, don't switch to all-purpose or you're going to be disappointed. The third thing that you need is instant yeast. I cannot overstate the importance of this. I'm gonna link it below. It's super inexpensive at Amazon. You get a 1 pound, it comes in like a brick form, all compressed and vacuum sealed. When you open it up, air gets into it and then you just pour it into a canister. So I use a quart-sized mason jar and keep it in my freezer that lasts me for 1 year of 3 times a week bread baking. I don't want you to be confused by the name instant and think that it's gonna be an inferior product. It is what all professional bakers use. Basically, it gives you the exact same results as regular yeast, except that it doesn't come in those annoying packets where the recipe calls for a teaspoon of yeast and your packet has 2 teaspoons of yeast and then you have leftover packets everywhere and it drives you crazy. Don't do that. Get it in bulk. You can get it either from King Arthur Flour's website or from Amazon. It is so much more cost effective and so much more practical. The fourth and final item that you will want if you are getting into bread making is a machine with which to knead your dough. Now again, there's a lot of misinformation about this. So a lot of people will say that bread machine bread has a dense texture and they don't like it. They only like it when it's kneaded by hand, and that is not true. What they're talking about is when bread is kneaded, risen, and then baked all in the machine, which is bad. It tastes gross. And it comes out in a loaf that's this weird tube shape, and it looks weird, it doesn't taste good. But what you're gonna use your bread machine for is just to knead your dough and have it rise once. Then you're gonna take the dough out of the machine, shape it into its final form, and finally bake it in your oven, not in the machine. Now, kneading by hand, in order to get good results, you will need to knead for over 30 minutes. And that is not fun. It might seem fun the first time you do it, but after that, it will not be fun. It will be extremely tedious. And not only that, you will never get as good of a result as you do when you let a machine do the kneading for you. So this machine is the most basic model you can get. It's about $70. I just got it at Walmart. And you don't need a fancy machine because you're not baking in it. You don't need a lot of cycles. You just need something that has a dough cycle that will knead and rise your dough. If you don't want to spend the $70, you can get started using your stand mixer. So your stand mixer has a dough hook, and that will knead your dough. You'll need to let it go for about 10 minutes on a low setting, maybe even more. And the problem with that is a stand mixer's motor is not designed to handle the dough. So it's gonna strain it a little bit, and over time it will probably shorten the life of your machine. But if you wanna get started with that, see if you like bread baking, that's fine. But I'd highly recommend switching over to a bread machine if you decide that it's something you're interested in. So those are the 4 items you will need to get started if you're interested in bread making. I hope you like this video. I'm gonna be sharing tons of recipes on bread in the upcoming weeks. We're gonna start with French bread and go all the way up to sourdough and more advanced things. So thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.